Hello, everyone. Welcome to this final talk of Dhamma Map 4. Um, and I'd like to begin by orienting us again to the overall sense of, what we're doing and why. So this map, if you will, is a subset of the totality of the Buddhist teachings, but it's a good representation of the whole of the Dhamma. And we'll be referring to it in such a way that we keep coming back to even this specific topology, so that over here you have dana, and over here you have metta, and over here you have gratification, danger, and escape, and gladness and happiness, and so on. So we can begin to have some orienting, grounding sense of the path. But really, our real orientation, as always, with all these talks, in fact, I hope with every encounter with the teachings, is beneath the concepts, dropping the conceptual, and coming to where the place before language comes closer, not only to the body, but to, let's say, the impermanence itself and the flow of our lives, really. But in this particular talk, because we're focusing on the path, I want to remember this sense of earth, of ground, and working the earth. And we all work the earth in different ways. But the path really calls us to that sense of, gravel and stone and soil and, all of the richness and dryness and hardness, nurturance of the earth. And remembering that even though these four talks gathered around the four truths, and this one gathers around the path, that all are, the path runs through the entire Dhamma, right? And so Dhamma is path, path is Dhamma in some sense. Ultimately, again, remember, it's beneath all the concepts. But the point is that there's these markers that can be useful. Now, I'll let you know that as I was preparing this last of the series, I was actually intimidated. I thought, how can I, in 1 hour, convey this, the whole of this life, the whole of this Dhamma, convey a sense of the path, the connection between Dhamma and path and life and Dhamma, all of that. How could I possibly do it? And again, to be honest, I actually went through the teachings and connected path factors, like the Noble Eightfold Path factors, and the dana and the sila and all this stuff with different pieces. And it's always a subset, it's always a subset. But I drew out special connections and I said, how can we get a sense of this? And I moved us through it. And I could do it within an hour. And it was positively, it was explosive. It got so conceptual, even though I felt each individual piece in my heart. It was just not possible. I mean, by this mortal, not possible. So I brought myself back down to basics. And the basics really aren't this, but it's the things we were covering in the other talk. What is the human predicament? And this becomes a grounding place, this pressurized system that's driven by tanha and, is constantly forming and reforming the world in this vortex of consciousness and body mind. And the core is the clinging, the grasping, where, the world is born, where we freeze and grip at things. And the tripod of suffering, the asavas, the intoxicants that flood us so we can't see what's going on, and we're driven by that to create a life like this, where this guy's, his head's buried in the melon. Oh, this is so good. This is, his greed is creating this lust for pleasure, but it's a hunger for pleasure that's driving that, right? Well, it's a hunger for pleasure that's also driving this guy's hatred. And this guy doesn't even know that this guy's going to, and this is us. This is, so how do you convey that? That's the starting point, right? Not the map. And the feeling experience, the living experience of there being, this felt sense of a material world and sensations and perceptions in the fabricating process. But if you remember, it's really important that this is not, you can't understand this in isolation. We are relational creatures. And the power of that is always functioning in our lives, always, even when we're alone. And the relational and social feedback loops when we're engaged, with our significant others or in society or even thinking about each other, amplifies both the wholesome and the unwholesome. Highly significant. So we're asking then in our work together, what's liberating at all those levels, individual, relational, social, and what's that look like? We talked about some of that in the last talk that was gathered around the third noble truth, but it aims the mind, right? And we touched that problem of nibbana or nibbanat, the idealization that makes it so distant and forgets the actual meaning, which is the cooling, right? The cessation, simply the cessation of the hunger and the intoxicants, the becoming, the ignorance, the greed, hatred, and delusion. And from that, the suffering, right? And the shedding of the shell of the self. And something happens that's very natural. And as that self gripping is shed, then the natural result, when there's no ignorance and clinging and so on, is care for all others. And in this, we saw the link between the personal, interpersonal, and social liberation. We understand that the path is cooling. It's very straightforward. And that our time together here is focused on the maps of cooling. So that brings us back to the map, right? I mean, we have a purpose here. And the Dhamma as an integrated whole means that every single element of this map relates to every other element. So everything we're talking about as we point to specifics is really a subset that we choose to focus on. So what are some specific skillful practices? Because we're focused around the path today. And the classical framing the Buddha offered is that the path always begins with giving, moving to morality, moving to the inspiration, if you will, of the heavenly abodes, the Brahma Viharas, and then on to renunciation. And only after that did he teach the Noble Eightfold Path. And as you read the discourses, what you see is that the whole of the Dhamma is practices, and the whole of this life is the path. I mean, it's obvious, actually, aside from being sensible. it's very clearly described. So as we look at each of the teachings, we're wondering, why are they important? How do they fulfill what the map teaches us, right? Solving the human dilemma, the suffering that overtakes us that's unnecessary. And how do these teachings open a pathway through the map? Like if we land with some specific practice, and we'll look at examples of that, and hopefully begin to get a sense of the whole, so that each of us individually, and then also working with our significant others and hopefully as a community, begin to craft a path that aims the life in the ways that are being described. So that's what we're about. And let's just jump right in, right, to this summary, if you will, of the human dilemma. So dependent origination, we looked at in enough detail to get a sense of how, blossoming out of ignorance, there's these constructing processes, and the constructing processes, the mental formations, aggregate and create a sense of, as the mind clings and remembers and so on, there's a sense of history from which each moment consciousness blossoms, right? And the experience of nama rupa, of name and form, of body mind, is dependent upon this consciousness that's already conditioned by the whole of our lives. So let's touch that right now, like in this moment, being conscious of the world. Right now it's me talking, maybe you're looking at a screen and all this kind of thing. Your body's in a chair and so on and so forth. This is it. It's not somewhere else. And so consciousness, or being cognizant of or aware of this sense of being alive, and this body mind is known and experienced like this. So name and form, body mind, arises dependent upon consciousness, but importantly, consciousness likewise arises dependent upon body mind. So there's this vortex that we've talked about, this feedback loop that Jnanananda really unpacked beautifully, where there's a constant, life seems to be a woven whole that's incredibly sensitive to the world, the sense bases, contact and feeling with the world, out of which comes thirst or tanha. And this thirst is driving the vortex, driving this system, and clinging to get secure in that. And that clinging becomes an identity. I am that tension. And I am born into the world, and I am born into death and sorrow and so on. So that's the problem we're talking about, right? Right now, that's our starting point. So how does this relate to this is our simple question. So as we said, the Buddha specifically said, let's not go straight to the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. We're not ready yet. You begin with dana. You begin with giving. So let's look at one possible trajectory of a, vast set of possibilities. How does dana support the cooling of this system? Isn't that the question? I love it. It's so simple. How does dana, and we'll ask this over and over again for different factors and different possibilities, solve this problem? Well, dana directly is a practice of relinquishment, right? So we're looking first at these, what I call this construct that I propose of the detox, which is based on the intoxicants, the relinquishment, right? Well, it's an act of relinquishing, the act of giving up something to which you are attached or which you value because it's in need. Someone else needs it, and it's a releasing, right? So it supports relinquishment. And it also supports effacement. And in the sense of the erosion of the self, which is, definition or a definition of effacement, when I give, I have to think what's needed. What does this person or this group need that I can offer? So we decenter from the self in care for others. So it supports that. And it supports wisdom in the sense of cause and effect. If I don't give, I stay in this selfish mode. The mind stays tight and kind of deformed. If I give, the mind is beautified, the heart is beautified. And also, there's this benefit. There's a follow-on benefit to myself, those to whom I give, and I'm also participating in a wholesome culture. And so the intoxicants begin to diminish. And remember, our point on this is that it's addressing the cooling of this system, right? So I'm asking you to pause for a moment and intuit into how the diminishing of those intoxicants, how the cultivation of dana, of giving, through that begins to depressurize this system. Let's take it another step further. As the mind is not flooded by this lusting for pleasure and to become and blinded by the ignorance, then naturally the greed, hatred, and delusion diminish, right? It's not driven by the insanity, the intoxication, right, of the body mind just wildly loose in the world. And how does the diminishing of greed, hatred, and delusion bring about the cooling of this system? Very straightforward, isn't it? So that takes us to the next one. And obviously one could go on and on from here, which is sila. So how does sila address this human dilemma? Well, let's take a different path this time. Again, we could go any direction to samvega and pasada, right? To zeal, urgency, and intensity about the importance of this now, right? That's samvega, boom. And pasada, the cool confidence. Well, let me put it this way. Sila at bottom is about safety. And when we get a sense of our potential for harm through how we live on the planet in wrong livelihood, destroy the planet or harm other beings through professions that are involved in killing and intoxicants and so on. When we look at how our actions of killing and stealing cause harm, there's an urgency there if we really get it, right? So the practice of sila is urgent, whether we realize it or not. But if we're making it a central practice, then this sense of urgency will begin to come up because we'll be reflecting on it. We'll be feeling what is the importance of it. But also, as we practice, right speech, harmonious speech and action and livelihood, then the cooling of pasada begins to happen. The confidence arises because we see the results of a good, wholesome life, a caring life. And if we're practicing in relationship, if we're practicing in community, we see the flow of that, and it begins to infuse not only our immediate relationships, but larger and larger circles. So we begin to participate really in a humane society and the confidence that comes out of that. So again, I ask, how does that relate to cooling the system? So from Samvega and Pasada, let's head up to the 5 faculties. So as there's this zeal, this urgency, we apply ourselves to the morality, and we're encouraged to also cultivate other qualities of the mind that support not only a moral life, but a wise life. So faith and energy, mindfulness grow, concentration and wisdom grow naturally out of this sense of zeal. And these are also defined as the 5 powers. It's a kind of a double definition here. So we could think of the empowerment of energy and how concentration or mindfulness empowers us to meet exactly this with skill, right? I mean, this makes a difference. And from here, we could look at how that then brings a greater confidence in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, which is more than, let's say, just a blind dedication, but it's an understanding of an actual awakening, right? Actually, the actual possibility of a human, and in this case, the Buddha, actually awakening, and the power of the Dhamma in that happening, and the not only efficacy, but the essential quality of community. So again, we can remember that this is what we're referencing. How does this understanding and confidence in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha cool this system, right? That sense of orienting the mind, orienting the heart towards something other than that tanha up there. Quite powerful. And that then gives us a consistency of persistence, of effort, right effort, and to, prevent the unwholesome, to abandon the already arisen unwholesome, to cultivate the as yet undeveloped wholesome, and to maintain what wholesome qualities are already developed. So in other words, it affects the whole of our path. So pause for just a moment and see if you've got a sense of the emergence of the path from the Dhamma, the living of the Dhamma in the whole of the path, and really essential how you feel in your life. This is effective in a way that matters. It's not just effective to something that doesn't matter. It deals in essences, right? So that takes us to, we remember the giving, the morality, and now the heavenly realms, the Brahma-viharas. And again, we could take any trajectory through here, but let's begin, interestingly, with concentration. So the Brahma-viharas are a classical means of cultivating concentration, and a common practice for entering into immersion, into jhana. But more generally, the body-mind calms down in the practice of the spaciousness, the friendliness of metta, and the care, and again, spaciousness of compassion and appreciative joy. And of course, the equanimity. So ask yourself, how does this, these relational factors, the Brahma-viharas and the concentration, contribute to the cooling of this system? So let's stop next at the vortex that we were talking about earlier. This vortex can be seen or understood um, in a very general way, pretty much at any time, like the way I was describing it a few minutes ago, you can get some sense of what I'm saying, or if you've thought about it, studied it yourself, perhaps you've sensed into, yeah, I kind of get this. But it's also an extremely subtle teaching. And the more still and gathered the mind is in samadhi, the more subtle aspects of the vortex can be known, or the manifesting of it. The incredible quickness with which this loop is building and rebuilding the world. And of course, this seeing begins to dismantle the process. It's seen as impersonal because it's exactly the personal that comes out of it. So we see the connection between that vortex and the formation of identity, the self. And it can be the self individually, me in relationship, me in as part of society, we as a society, we as a culture. All of us who are, let's say, patriotic, or who are committed to a religion and feel kinship with others in that religion or others in that sports team, anything. The collective is participating in the driving of the vortex and the identity, even if it's a mass identity. And of course, this system is going about unbridled. But what we're talking here is through the concentration, the dismantling of all layers of identity. So we see in this case, remember, we began with the Brahma Viharas over here. And as identity diminishes, of course, the greed, hatred, and delusion, poof, undercut, which then also, as we saw, deflates that system. And not bad, not a bad return on investment, you might say, beginning with metta. And so the last piece before going to the Eightfold Path, the Buddha named as the renunciation, which I'm putting under the relinquishment of detox. So obviously the relinquishment aspect, the renunciation specifically, is directly connected to the renunciation in right intention. It's one of the three classical wholesome intentions. And the reason I wanted to focus on that, because we could, of course, go anywhere on this map, is that it really is helpful in terms of path, in terms of understanding this teaching, that intention is the aim. It's the aim of one's mind, right? So depending upon one's intention, the heart goes and actions flow from that. Very important to sense what is meant by intention. And so in cultivating this intention of renunciation, what we're getting is a re-aiming of the life. And the coming out of that wise intention will be right livelihood at the level of an entirely different relationship to money, to resources. And when renunciation is deep in the aim, then how we live on the planet is different. There's none of this rapacious behavior that is so damaging. The sucking of resources from the planet and the oppression of human beings based on finding comfort and based on getting more pleasures and so on, because the aim is renunciation. So not only does any individual system cool down, but remember that the social, relational is also cooling down on this path. It's integral to the whole thing. So let's move on to this problem. Tanha, driving the clinging, the gripping, the upadana, right? So if you'll recall, what we cling to could be each other in gripping and grasping, trying to stabilize myself. We could be gripping and grasping to sensual pleasures, to viewpoints and beliefs, to habits. We could be gripping and clinging just onto each sense contact, in gripping in fear, or holding on to our wish to escape from pain, or holding on, of course, to the pleasure. And that in that, this is where we build the world, right? A sense of self and world. And that, again, as we know, is driven by tanha. And so how does this problem relate to this map? You oriented? And let's again follow the Buddha's advice. Let's begin with dana, giving. And giving, of course, directly addresses clinging, right? Directly addresses this whole problem, because in giving, it's a release. It's a release of the clinging. It's a release, a letting go, an offering, so you can feel the relaxing. And it's a very direct, diminishing of the energy of the grasping and the gripping. But let's take it a step further. As the clinging diminishes, what do we have? Well, we begin to see the fruits of the path in contentment. And we can see things as they are, because we're not blinded by our preferences. And again, this system over here is, there's no energy that's going to drive that, the robot arm of grasping. When there's contentment, we're talking about the cooling, the cessation of nibbana, nirodha, right? The peace that comes with that. Very straightforward. So let's go on to sila, which was next, right? So how does sila address this issue? Well, first of all, in sila, we see that relaxing happens, right? There's non-remorse. The Buddha speaks about one can be happy and glad, abiding day and night in one's practice on one's path. But let's look at a trajectory through this. So there's the gladness. And with the gladness, there's a different way of living with this morality, this happiness. And there's these 8 criteria of Dhamma that begin to manifest. So let's take a special look at those, because that's a pretty powerful teaching. So the Buddha was saying, these 8 criteria, if they're met, if the path leads to dispassion, not to passion, to being unfettered, not to being fettered, to shedding, not accumulating, to modesty, not self-aggrandizement, to contentment, seclusion, aroused persistence, to being unburdensome, you can know this is what I've taught. Pretty basic and central. So the question now is, how does practicing sila bring this about? So just think for a moment. How does refraining from killing lead to, for example, being unburdensome? Or how does it lead to being unfettered or to dispassion? How does refraining from taking what is not given lead to modesty, or to shedding, not to accumulating? How does refraining from sexual misconduct lead to contentment, not discontent, or to being unburdensome, not being burdensome? How does refraining from lying contribute to modesty, not self-aggrandizement, to dispassion, to being unburdensome and content. How does refraining from intoxicants lead one to being unburdensome? Oh my God. How does it lead to being unfettered, not bound, not tied down, to dispassion? So that's all fairly evident. And of course, the question is ultimately, not ultimately, but right now, how does it cool this system? All of those qualities, right? Cool the system. So this brings us to the Brahma Viharas again, right? After Sila. And this time, let's start with that contentment in metta, in compassion, in the equanimity. There's contentment, and of course, the whole system begins to cool, right? That's fairly straightforward. And from the contentment, that clinging that is represented in this problem here, the clinging to views and to habits, precepts, practices, a sense of self. Right? There's a letting go because one is contented and the clinging has no energy behind it. There's nothing to drive it. And when the clinging diminishes, the identity diminishes, because remember, if you go back to dependent origination, upadana pachaya bhavo, depending upon this grasping, this clinging, arises the sense of self, the becoming, the birth, moment by moment or life by life, the diminishing of the identity, which further cools this system, and cessation, nirodha, the cooling. Which brings us to this problem of the asavas, right? This strong, stable tripod of ignorance, the thirst or lust for the senses, and for becoming. And I want to remind us what is meant by this problem, this kind of the stability of suffering represented right here, where they're all connected and supporting each other. What is the problem here? Just reminding you, because we did cover it in, I think, the second talk, first, I'm not sure, that the sensory lust keeps us in agitation. So the ignorance, is maintained by the sensory lust. The sensory lust also supports the becoming, the I am, because I am the one that must be pleasured, right? So those are mutually reinforcing. And these two together then keep the ignorance going. And the becoming, the I am, is further intensifying the sensory lust as one's sense of me in the middle grows. And likewise, the ignorance keeps the sensory lust going, and the ignorance obviously keeps the becoming growing, because we don't even see the problem. We don't even know that there's a problem or look for a way out because of the ignorance. So that's the problem we're talking about now. How does that problem relate to that map? I want to make sure you're with me. It's a lot. How does that problem relate to that map? The flooding of the mind, the intoxication, the blindness with which we grow through life. Well, rather than start with the Dana and Sila, let's jump right over to this part of the Dhamma: anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, suffering, not self. How does that relate to this problem? Well, when this is contemplated deeply, then the fact of suffering becomes immediate, right? It becomes so clear, and you see it in your life, you see it in your relationships, You see it not only between people, you see it in the culture at large, and not just the suffering of the dukkha, right? The pain that is pain, but the pain of impermanence, the pain of the constructing processes that just add layer after layer of anguish. And how would seeing that begin to dismantle this intoxication system? Well, for one thing, when we see that pain, the compassion is, a natural result. We see the pain in ourselves, we see the pain in others, we see the pain in the world, and the heart vibrates with this in a balanced way that is moved to act, but really feels it. One cries for the world. So can we sense that this is going to de-intoxicate, to detox, to prevent these floods from taking us over? And as a result, this is the beginning, or shall we say, this is a doorway into the arising of right view, samadhi. We see cause and effect. We see the effects of our actions. We see the effect also, driven by these dynamics, you might say, of impermanence. Trying to grasp at what's impermanent is suffering, cause and effect. Trying to stabilize a self that is impermanent is suffering, cause and effect, right view. And as this happens, then the teaching on gratification, danger, and escape is no longer a teaching. It's like, wow, right there. We see the gratification that comes with the senses. Oh yeah, that tastes good, or that's fun, or that's, I feel secure in this situation. We see that gratification, no problem. But we also see how we fall into the trance, as we've talked about all this, right? You fall into the trance and get stuck. And as soon as you're in the trance, then the whole becoming feels absolutely real. And then from there on in, you just kind of move around in your, in this part of the system, right? In the whole contact, feeling, clinging, becoming, and fall in. But now we're seeing it, right? We're functioning from wise view now. And we understand there's an alternative, an escape, if you will. And from this, release, cooling. So we see that there's a direction here, right? Sense of the cooling of this aspect of the human dilemma. And I wanted to also start with another viewpoint where, here we're talking about the life lived in the whole of the path. That's what's referred to here. And how does this connect to the Eightfold Path? How does this connect to the cooling of this, right? Well, one cultivates mindfulness and concentration on this path. And right now I'll speak not only about mindfulness throughout our lives, but about formal practices, right? Really dropping more deeply into a balanced sati and samadhi. And what happens? Where does that lead? Well, through insight, there's the cultivation of right view, understanding the impermanence and so on, but also understanding kind of the core of this issue of the vortex and nama rupa, body, mind, and so on. It's, the nature of right view that arises when sati and samadhi are strong. It's a wide spectrum understanding that develops. And from that, the whole gripping around identity social, relational, all of it. The whole alienation drops away. And how does that affect this? Remember, let's be oriented to the purpose. And the understanding of tanha, the experience of it, the heart begins to let go because it's not, there's no self there's no gripping at the self that's driving that tanha. The greed, hatred, and delusion diminish. Really important, as you'll see. And the non-manifesting of greed, hatred, and delusion is defined as nibbana in this very life, the cooling in this very life. In this very life, right? So this cooling is, the manifesting, if you will, manifests as disenchantment, dispassion, deliverance. And a life lived in this way brings us back to the totality of that experience, of the living experience of disenchantment, dispassion, and the living experience of metta, of compassion. That's the lived life is manifesting that. So this, not necessary. So these poor guys, I mean, don't you feel sorry for anyone that's trapped like that? Which includes you and me, sorry to say, but we're doing better. These guys are basically just like you and me, it's khandhas, it's aggregates. The totality, a sense of, it's that simply a way of describing what is this experience and remembering the relational, right? Only now, as a result of our work on the path, we're mutually amplifying the wholesome, and we're not mutually amplifying the unwholesome. Very beautiful shift. And so our practices that help us understand this, the practices of understanding and the khandhas, is very, very powerful stuff. We talked about it in a prior talk in this series. But let's just say that this Dhamma Map provides contemplations that we can take into our lives, like do we see form as rising and vanishing, and feeling as rising and vanishing, and so on, as impermanent, suffering, and not self, noticing the clinging and the non-clinging. These are all classical teachings as practices, right? This is the point the reason I'm giving so much attention to this right here is that you get that this isn't an abstract teaching. These are practices. So we look at the gratification, the danger, and the escape in relationship to form and feeling and perceptions and so on. Practice. And this is perhaps one of the most common teachings throughout the discourses that's largely ignored today, in favor of fairly narrow spectrum of practices. But the Buddha says, okay, bhikkhus or bhikkhunis, is form permanent or impermanent? It's impermanent, sir. Well, is what is impermanent satisfactory, unsatisfactory? Well, duh, sir, it's unsatisfactory. Well, is what's impermanent and unsatisfactory proper to regard as mere mind? Do you control it? Is it really yours? Well, no. And then it's the same thing for feeling, perceptions, fabrications, consciousness. Practice, powerful practice. Throughout life, in formal sitting, whatever. That it's fragile, that in cessation of the gripping, it's unfragile. I mean, how beautiful is that? This is what ceases. No more gripping. No more I am this. This is what's exquisite. So these are practices, really giving us a sense of the Dhamma as a map, and the map and the Dhamma as practices. And one last piece on this is the powerful way that Paticca Samuppada, dependent origination, is also a map of meditation techniques. If we look at each of these individually, for example, if we take just ignorance, this places us right at the, drop it, drop the ignorance. This is your practice. Stop it, right? There's some Zen traditions that function like that. Manjushri sword, cut through it. Or, talk about, for example, a more contemporary teacher like Joseph Goldstein. His entire kind of grounding point is non-clinging. That's, an approach. Or Goenka, whose practice centers around feeling, around Vedana. And there are a number of Thai teachers with the same. My Thai teacher, Ajahn Soban, very focused around Nama Rupa. And I practiced with him in that form, and I didn't have it oriented around this map, but also dependent origination. If you look at it in pairs, like what's this connection between ignorance and the fabricating processes? And just contemplate and live in that space in your life, not just in formal practice, or between those constructing processes and the arising of consciousness based on the archive of your own mental history. Or the classical one, a really powerful one, and I think most of you have done this in some way, the relationship between feeling, contact and feeling, or feeling and thirst, tanha, and then between thirst and the gripping, the hunger and the gripping, right? So in pairs, very powerful contemplations. And also this whole thing as a meditation method, so moving through it and moving through it again, right, as a practice. So a very powerful map, all aimed at the same cooling. So let's just go one last piece. How does this individual, relational, social cooling relate to the map overall, real generally? It's a million things you could say, right? But we can say it's a path of renunciation, path of gladness. We could say it's a path of moral action, of care for others, of society and all living systems in how we live. It's a path of calming down, the right effort to calm down. It's a path of mindfulness, knowing when you're stuck, knowing how to not get stuck, that there are alternatives, remembering, bringing those to mind as a mindfulness practice, combined with right view, wisdom. And deep practice, is a part of this path to experience new levels of peace. And we've tried to stay as close as we can, I hope, in these talks to our sense of humanity, the sense of beauty, the sense of our participation in the whole of life, a sense of our own anguish and the anguish that we're surrounded by. And this is where the path lives, right? It doesn't live somewhere in the sky. It's not a religious, distant thing. It's right here in birth and in our depravity and in death. Does your path prepare you for death of those you love? Does it prepare you for your own death? This is very, direct and real. This is what we're doing here. And does it shift how we are in the world, how we relate to nature, and how we live in the unknown, the mystery of things? And this is why I find uh, the Buddha's teaching on effacement so important, that, right here, along with, deliverance and concentration and knowledge, you find, teachings on not being fraudulent and deceitful, not being bad friends, but being good friends, not being negligent. And so very human qualities of goodness that we can all understand. So considering the path in this light, in light of our humanity, in light of death, in light of birth, what is the role of intimate relationships, of family? Is that something other than the path? So, I don't know about you, but when I ask myself that question, I say, well, what has contributed more to effacement, more to the erosion of my self-centeredness and arrogance? Being a father and raising my sons, being married for 45 years and facing my son's cancer or my own cancer and all this, that, or sitting in meditation? What's brought about more effacement? There's no contest, I'm sorry. It's, it's this lived life. So the point isn't that effacement in everyday life is superior to effacement that happens on the cushion. The point is that they contribute to each other. And together, it's extraordinarily powerful what happens, and to not discount what's happening in everyday life in terms of the path. And you can ask yourself that question and see where you get. And would you really separate the path from your work life, from your engagement in society? Because where is this work happening of being honest and humble, of being a good friend, being diligent and morally careful? So this cooled life is not just an individual enterprise, right? It's happening relationally, not as an add-on. It is intrinsically relational, just as it is intrinsically individual. And we're embedded in society and formed by it, and we mutually form it. So the process cannot possibly be separate from that. It's not technically possible, but we construct it as separate. So it's the whole of our lives. It's always around us. And it's a totality: formal practice, informal practice, practice not as practice, but as we live naturally in the fruits of our practice. This map that we've been talking about is leading at once to that human goodness and to the cessation in the most refined sense. It's all untangling the tangle. So you could possibly see why, when I developed the 6 tenets of the whole life path, it's a sense of putting the map to work and answering this question: how can I, a layperson, live a life immersed in the Dhamma? I'm not a monastic. What's this life look like? And given the depth of my own ignorance and thirst, but also that I'm surrounded by dysfunctional social structures that will keep reinforcing, whether it's my white privilege or my personal arrogance, or the privilege of class and education. How do I live a life that's framed by things that will continue to try to keep me small and greedy? How can I realize the potential that was modeled by the Buddha? And that's where these tenets are rooted. And in putting the map to work, living this immersed life in this human system, we're engaging the teachings individually, relationally, socially. And we let them in all the way, right? All the way, not arm's length. Otherwise, it's kind of playing with it. It can still be useful, but there's a real difference when the teachings are let in fully. And if we belittle ourselves and we don't feel that the teachings that we're studying in the Dhamma, that the teachers tell us about, that if we don't believe we can experience something of the fragrance of these teachings, they'll say, not me, it's too far away, and we don't try to live inside our potential. But they can be experienced here and now. And no moment is left out. No teaching is left out, right? So we looked at the whole map overall, which is a substantial core of the totality of the Dhamma. It's certainly not the whole thing. But no teaching is left out of the path, not just of the thinking process of how we live, because all the teachings are practices. And it's in that way that the Dhamma is the foundation. Not as some abstract thing, but as a living experience. So no moment is left out. Pretty rich diet. I hope you're doing okay. And we'll just kind of sit for just a moment quietly and, nothing formal, just to let it absorb. And then if there's any questions, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask them. But thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Or comments. It doesn't have to be questions. I see someone was asking about the fifth and sixth tenet of the whole life path. I remember which one the sixth one is that it's individual and relational and social. The fifth and fourth, I might be confusing, but I could also go back to it if you want. But it's also on the website, so. But I'll help you out. We'll check into it later. Thanks, Rachel.
Gregory, this is Mariah. I found myself really excited when you showed the slide on all the different ways we can practice with, the five aggregates. And I was also trying to copy it, but it was just, the rising and vanishing, the clinging and the non-clinging, viewing it from the perspective of impermanent suffering and not self. And that, we do that in retreat often, or when we have ID practice with partners, but thinking about how we carry that in our individual lives, when we're out watering the garden, or trying to get to this meeting on time or something. I would love to see what else you might offer, and even see that slide again if it's easy to get back to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I can speak from my direct experience, Mariah. I wasn't taught by a teacher to do this or how to do this. This was me encountering the suttas them coming alive as teachings for me, and then living them to more deeply understand them and try to enact them, try to learn from them directly, personally. So that I just giving you a caveat. I'm not passing on some wisdom that is, let's say, more tested by, the tradition of my teachers. So I'm just being honest about that. But let me go back to that slide, in fact, and we can talk about that. But first, let me do this. And for Rachel, and so you'll see that the fifth one is the teachings must be let in fully. So just not keeping them at arm's length. That takes care of that. But let me go to this. Okay. And so, for example, rising and vanishing is, there's a name for it that I can't remember. This practice is so classical, it's got its own name. And I'm sorry, I wish I would, could appear very smart and know what it is, but it's one of those things that escapes me right now. But you can actually, rising and vanishing is a subtle thing, so I don't think I would recommend it, like try to get a real detailed sense of that while you're on your way to a meeting. I don't think it would work. But what certainly is available to you is this clinging and non-clinging, right here. So, and just ask yourself, you see, this is a schema. It's an idea around which the mind can, with which the mind can sort of place a lens over experience and say, okay, is there clinging generally? And that's good, but it's kind of hard to get traction. It's like not so easy. But if you just say, am I clinging to a feeling? How about start with an easy one? So you're looking for wherever there's a pleasant or an unpleasant sensation. You could look for the neutral, but it's more subtle. And if you're on your way to a meeting, it's going to be harder to do. But it's easy on your way to a meeting to notice if there's a pleasant or unpleasant, let's say, emotional state. You're worried because so-and-so, a certain person is going to be at that meeting and your gut is tightened up. Well, is there clinging to the feeling, or is there clinging, let's say, to the construction, to the sankhara, to the kind of the mental formations about the history with this person and so on, clinging or non-clinging to constructions? It's no longer that person. It's this constructing process, and you've already broken something of the grip it has on your like it's real. Some of the trance has been broken. Or am I clinging to perceptions right now? So as you're reaching for the car door, or as you're perceiving when you're in the meeting and you see this person and it's a human being and it's certain colors and shapes, that's perception. Am I grasping? And what am I fabricating from it becomes then the constructions. But you can get more elemental right there in the meeting. And if you want, you could be looking at gratification, danger, and escape. Let's say you're tense, okay? You're at that meeting and you're tense. Well, there's some kind of gratification there. I'm telling you, it doesn't sound that way, does it? It sounds like, oh, this is unpleasant. I don't like being tense. The mind, the heart is holding on to something because it thinks it can get something. It wants control. It wants to understand. It wants to make it right. It wants it to be different. It's holding on because it thinks it will find satisfaction there. And it's even maybe holding on to the sense of self. It's me who's in opposition to this person. So you can look for that. Look for the gratification when it's pleasant also. You're over at a friend's house having tea. What's the gratification? What's pleasant here? And is there a danger? You know, am I falling into mindlessness with this friend is basically what we're talking about. Not is having friends dangerous, having a pleasant chat over tea, but am I falling into this enchantment of, the becoming, the fabricating of the world? I am that, she is that, we are this. And it then just sort of feeds the forward movement of delusion. But it doesn't have to. You can be with the friend, have it be pleasant, and also be awake. And if you contemplate gratification, danger, and escape, it helps you be awake. Those are a couple of examples.
I have a question. Thank you for this, very helpful. And just from direct experience in relation to Mariah's question and what you were just talking about in terms of practices, what I noticed yesterday in the midst of engaging in everyday things, driving my daughter to her class and coming back, being in the traffic, attending to daily mundane tasks. And at the same time, I was so intent on practicing and staying awake. So I was noticing the clinging, release, or rising and vanishing of stories and self-making. But the challenge was, and it got really disorienting at some point, was so as I am moving through life and people, getting things done, and at the same time, there is mindfulness of the clinging, and then there's the practice of, okay, let me release, allow, relax, and all that. But then the whole process became so disorienting that is a bit like, that's my question right now, that in the midst of going through things and then seeing what's happening, but being unable to completely let go or not cling, like both things operating at the same time, almost like racing with each other. And one is winning, let's say mindlessness winning, mindfulness noticing that, catching up, and then mindfulness winning.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Have you ever seen a film of a cow or a horse or a deer being born? And they come out and within about a minute, they go to stand up. And as they go to stand up, it's like, oh, there's a leg. Oh, this is a leg too. Oh, there's another leg. And then, there's another leg. And, and gradually it's like, then they end up like this. And then they try to walk as, ooh, and then down again. And then, and within, literally a couple of minutes, these amazing creatures are walking. I mean, it's a little weird, but they're walking. It's kind of like that. What you're doing is jumping in to a powerful practice, a powerful teaching, while driving your daughter somewhere. I mean, it's non-trivial. And so it's like being born into this world with this complex body. And how do I do? Imagine being Frankenstein. Poor guy. How did poor Frankenstein get around, the little monster guy? We're like that. And but that's why we do formal practices because then the mindfulness piece of it becomes more natural and smooth. It doesn't require so much cognitive effort. It's like just available. That's why we reflect using the thinking mind, so that the nature of clinging becomes known in its features intellectually, and then it becomes more available and can be manifested or drawn upon intuitively. And so as I'll just stop there. So as the mindfulness, let's say, and the understanding of upadana, of clinging, come together, now here you are with your daughter, and you've got some natural qualities supporting you, and it can meet a heavier load. And that same, if you will, formula of this gradual training, gradual practice, gradual progress is one way of defining the whole of the path, that these things weave together and form, let's say, liberative options rather than, imprisonment. So sometimes it's awkward or disorienting. And if you feel like you're pushing too hard, like it's just really, too awkward, too painful, too weird, that you're ignoring your daughter because you're so worried about clinging or, whatever, then just back off.
Sure.
Yeah, that's where you have this perfection of khanti, of patience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What I did was I contacted a spiritual friend and exchanged a couple lines, and that was supportive. That was a good refuge, which calmed things down. So,
Good
yeah,
move. Good
thank
move.
you.
Yeah, very good move.
Thank you, Greg, so much. And I think you're unpacking with Ozam and Mariah this moment-to-moment way to engage this sort of answers the place I was getting kind of tangled, which is, I keep going back to this notion of the cooled life. And then I think of, diving into racial justice work and this sort of fiery ardency that is needed.
Right.
And I think I understand what you're moving towards, especially in the social context. So there's for me, it's almost, if I just look at it metaphorically, like, how does the cooled life create the energy, fiery engagement with injustice that is necessary? And I think I can imagine what the answer might be, but I'd love to hear you speak to that a bit.
Well, the first, that's a wonderful question, and one that, I've pondered somewhat. And I want to point, if I could again, to the Samvega, right? That's a teaching on zeal. And it's zeal as it relates to, to all of this. But we're speaking now about, you might say, essential zeal. And as one becomes more sensitized, as the noise of the the alienated, encapsulated self begins to soften, a natural result, certainly in my experience, is the emergence of compassion, of care for others, because one's self-obsession is diminishing. So the Samvega, the zeal, has a orientation that is not selfish. There's a kind of a breaking of that false duality between one's own liberation and the liberation of others. And if that is not balanced with the pasada, with that cooling confidence, then what you get is burnout. if it's not balanced with wisdom, with right view, and with the tranquility of, the joy and energy and so on, then the world is so decimated, the world is so hurt that we will burn out. And if you have any doubt about that, speak to a helping professional. Speak to someone who is either a social worker or a psychotherapist, someone who is on the front lines of social justice work or environmental work. You will burn out if there's not balance. In that case, there's I turn to the definition, if you will, or the metaphor of the water purifying gem of the Dhamma, and a holistic view, which is, I hope, what's begun to emerge through this series of talks, will nourish this individual path, but it will absolutely, in the same way that we're talking about, nourish a path of commitment to social justice. There's no division. And I was just powerfully gratified by having just finished what I would call the first Insight Dialogue retreat that I've taught, and I co-taught it with Tuari Sala and Nick Redfern, with Mary Burns in the kind of background, participating, shadowing, wherein we brought up these hot issues of climate change, of social justice, and the practice didn't fall apart. First time I've really seen the depth of practice come together. Wasn't easy to find a way there. It's taken us a few years of pretty funky retreats, but we're gradually learning. But I think that what you're asking, Pat, which is really an important question, is an important learning for our community, but for each of us also individually, or for whoever we're working with. How can the wisdom come in? How can we remember the compassion, the zeal, the care, the urgency, and the cooling, and the wisdom? And as soon as we make a division, we're headed towards some kind of stress, unnecessary stress, and probably decreasing our chances of effectiveness, and increasing our chances of difficulty, whether it's burnout or bad decisions, bad relationships. How many movements have fallen apart based on leaders that get demented, or based on communities that fall into internal conflict while they're trying to solve external conflict, So what you ask is very important. Thank you. So with that, we come to the end of the whole series. And my profound wish is that you feel empowered to move through the path with this vision of a whole life, a whole path, and how you can begin to work with that skillfully, not dependent upon, let's say, me or any other teacher, but you establish a direct relationship with the teachings and begin to see how they're acting and can be further activated in each moment of your life. May you be free, and may all beings benefit from our time together, our practice, those we know, those we don't know, the beings that are nearby and far away, the seen and the unseen, the born and the yet to be born, every type of consciousness. May all beings be free from suffering. May there be peace. May there be peace. May there